Hello, so welcome to this. This is the final talk and discussion of the Archetypes in the Middle Way series in the Middle Way network. So this last talk is about the Middle Way archetype. I'll get down to that in a moment. Just a few things to mention in relation to the whole series. So we get into the end of the series. It will be followed up by a retreat at Tyrwelyn House, which is the retreat centre I founded in Wales with my partner. So if you're within travelling distance, you're very welcome to come along to Wales to discuss the sorts of things that have arisen in the series. So that will be in February. Have a look on our website, tyrwelynhouse.org, for more details. And this series, which was on Archetypes in the Middle Way, will be followed up starting in February, starting on the 7th of February with a new series. So all the details of that are on the Middle Way Society website. If you look under the events tab there. So that includes, well, the topic of the whole series is the 5 principles of the Middle Way and the threefold practice. So I will be talking a bit about the 5 principles before the end of this talk, a bit more about what they're about. But basically, it's a way of understanding what the Middle Way involves, what the practice of the Middle Way involves. So we'll be breaking it up over the course of a whole year with monthly talks and discussions. Okay, so I will now get into today's talk then, which is on the Middle Way archetype. So this is the 9th and final Archetypes of the Middle Way. So during the last 4 sessions, we've been looking at specific archetypal functions. So we've been looking at the hero and the shadow and the animus and God archetype. And we've been looking at them specifically in the overall context of Middle Way practice. So Middle Way practice in general roughly means finding an experiential route between absolutized extremes. So whatever the absolutes you encounter in a judgment at any point, so we have to choose the middle way at each point. The middle way is the one that allows us to, by avoiding the absolute extremes, find the route between, which is justified through experience. But that's quite a difficult path to tread, as one finds out when one gets more into it and discusses what it involves. And that's why archetypes are important. So seeking inspiration from archetypes to follow the middle way obviously could be an important part of it. Another important aspect of the middle way, as we've been discussing it, and archetypes, as we've been discussing them, is the distinction between meaning and belief. So one of the key messages I want to get across really is that we can experience inspiration from archetypal symbols up to and including God even, as meaning without importing lots of absolute beliefs about them. So we can separate inspirational meaning from absolutized belief, which is particularly crucial when it comes to approaching religion. Okay, so that's been the path we've been treading so far. Now we'll see the culmination of this process is what we're reaching now, which is to bring archetypal inspiration and middle way practice together in the most direct fashion by considering the inspiration, the direct inspiration offered by the middle way itself. So can the middle way itself be an archetype? is the question I'm asking. And overall, I think it can, with a few qualifications, but it's, as I'll try and explain, the middle way does have many of the features of an archetypal function, or it can. Yeah, so similar to the other archetypal functions I've been discussing in the previous sessions. So, you know, it can help to inspire us in central issues of our lives, maintaining integration, maintaining a sense of continuity, purpose, and so on in our lives. So the middle way can have that function, but it's kind of debatable whether it's a full archetypal function, because you could also interpret it as an aspect of the practice of the other four functions. So that's why I think of it as a kind of 4.5 function. In some ways, it's sort of another function, sort of a fifth function, but not maybe totally. Of course, the four functions come from Jung, and you know, at times he did emphasize those four functions in his account of archetypes. And in other places, well, particularly in the Red Book, Jung also mentions the middle way, but it has to be agreed that Jung doesn't talk about the middle way in quite the same way as he talks about the archetypes. So yeah, certainly as a fifth function, it doesn't come from Jung. It's more my addition and interpretation, obviously, of the archetypal approach. Okay, so whether it's a full archetypal function in its own right doesn't really matter. It's more a question of, well, is it helpful to think of it like that? You have to draw your own conclusion. So the middle way function. So as I mentioned, all archetypal functions use symbols, and they do that to help us to maintain longer term attitudes or intentions, to kind of pull together our scattered lives, and you know, different attitudes at different points, our inconsistencies and so on. How can we integrate ourselves better? How can we pull ourselves together better? Well, we need reminders, and the archetypal functions do that. And they do that in different ways. So in the course of this series, I've been talking about goals, relationships, responses to threats, and overall potential. So those are respectively the hero, anima, animus, shadow, and God archetypes, the functions of those four different archetypes. So whatever it is you're trying to be more long-term, sustainably consistent about, the archetype can help you by evoking mental associations associated with helpful states and approaches. So once you've discovered a helpful approach, if you associate it with a symbol, that symbol can keep coming back to you and reminding you in a deeper way of what you set out to do, what is most important to you. So that's how I see the function of archetypes. And just a reminder here that the idea of a function is not reductive, although sometimes I know the word function is used in a sort of reductive way. It's just a function, but there's no just here. To say it's a function is another way of describing it, of understanding it. It doesn't mean we've got a complete description of what we're doing. We can't say it's just a particular description, because it involves long-term possibilities and unknowns. So it's not like a reduction to, for example, evolutionary theory. That's sometimes sort of functional reductions are used for that. So, so the middle way function, as a kind of fifth function after the other four, is distinctive in that it balances awareness of conditions with ideals. So we got things we're inspired by, perhaps we're aiming to maybe become a better person, or become enlightened, or have better relationships, or whatever it is we're aiming to do. But we're not going to get anywhere with that unless we also take into account where we are now, where we start, and all the difficulties that we might actually have to encounter in practice. So that's awareness of conditions. So all the time we need to keep our eye on both things, both the conditions we started with and the ideals we're aiming towards. We can't just let go of one of them and only concentrate on the other. So there's constant tension between the two. So it's not just a reminder of the ideals, it's the process of reaching them that the middle way is about. So that's what the middle way function as an archetype can remind us of, if we are inspired to recall not just that we have ideals, but also that we need to address the conditions involved all the time in order to work towards those ideals. If we're brought back to an effective way of working with that tension. So you could see that just as a way of making the ideals themselves more adequate. So you could say, for example, if you're talking about the God archetype kind of stands for your ideals, or maybe or maybe the idea of enlightenment, which is, as I explained last time, is related to the God archetype, or a symbol of the God archetype. Now, so you could just say, well, in order to reach those ideals or to get closer to them, you're going to have to address the conditions. So that's just what's involved in following that ideal. Okay, fair enough. If you adopt a sophisticated enough understanding of what it means to pursue that ideal. But very often people forget that side of it. They get swept away by the ideal itself and think that the ideal itself is the whole story, and they forget about all the boring stuff, if you like, the what it's like to be them, and all the particular weaknesses they have to deal with, and all the social constraints and all the economic constraints and all the stuff we have to deal with to actually get anywhere. Yeah, there could be limitations in just focusing on the ideals, and that's where the middle way archetype can come in as a reminder that we have to do a bit more than that. So you could also then see the middle way archetype as a completely different kind of inspiration, one that is associated for you with that tension, with constantly coming back to the conditions as well as the ideals, holding them together. So if that's what the middle way can mean for you sufficiently well, then it can keep inspiring you. Certainly I have to say, for me personally, it's the main thing that inspires me, I have to say. See, that's not going to work for everybody. So let's think a bit about the middle way function in relation to schemas. Now, I think I mentioned schemas going back maybe the second or third talk in this series when I started talking about embodied meaning, or maybe even the first one, actually. So a schema is kind of an embodied basis for meaning. So this comes from the writings and ideas of these two great pioneers of embodied meaning, George Lakoff and Mark Johnson. So yeah, it's a schema in a particular sense, an embodied schema. So embodied schema comes from a certain sort of experience. So we have certain sorts of experiences, and we associate them with particular sets of meaning, or areas of meaning, shall we say. And the two schemas involved in the middle way, particularly, are bringing them together, are balancing and moving forward. So these are everyday, constant experiences for us in our bodies. We're always, you just have to walk across the room and you're balancing and you're moving forward. And obviously, if you can't do either of those things, then you notice and you have problems walking across the room. But perhaps we're only conscious of it when we start to have problems with it. So if you think of those two things, balancing is the source of a whole load of metaphors. Moving forward also is a schema for a whole load of metaphors. So Lakoff and Johnson call this the source path goal schema. So if you're moving forward, you've got places starting, your source, you've got path, and you've got goal where you're going to, even if it's just the other side of the room. So there's that basic physical experience of a path, which we turn into metaphors. So we use that general area of association between our bodies and other things in order to get meaningful ideas, which have various effects on us, which mean things to us, about paths, for example, and about balancing. So the middle way brings those together. It's a path which is also balancing. So yeah, if you're balancing as you move along a path, then each move forward is adjusted to the left and to the right in relation to the whole system. And by the whole system, I mean both you and the world around you. So both inside and outside, we're adjusting our muscles and our skeletons and so on as we move. Our nervous systems are in charge of all that. So that constant adjustment is the metaphor for the middle way in some ways. So as you move, you adjust. So you can think of the middle way as sort of mapping onto that experience. Yes. So any symbol of the middle way, which is going to be meaningful to you, is going to relate to that basic experience in some way. So it's not just a metaphor. And so sometimes when I've talked about the middle way, someone's come back to me and said, yeah, but it's just a metaphor. In a way, it is a metaphor, obviously, but it's the importance of the metaphor comes from the combining of those two schemas. So it's the centrality of those two schemas and the importance of combining them that makes it more than just a metaphor. So when you move forward, there has to be goal, and when you balance, there has to be bodily awareness and awareness of conditions around you. Just as if you're moving forward on the middle way in a more metaphorical sense, you've got a goal, well, maybe not an ultimate goal, but you've got some sort of goal. You've got things you want to achieve, which you may adjust as you go. It's a provisional goal, perhaps. You do have ideas about where you're going. And you're also adjusting, well, you've got both bodily and psychological awareness there, mapping onto the bodily awareness of the physical balancing. And of course, there's the awareness of conditions. So if you're going to walk across the room without tripping up or bumping into things, you've also got to be aware of the conditions around you. And similarly, with the middle way, that requires you to be aware of the stuff that's going on in the world and how you interact with it. So that's a dynamic experience that we're relating to symbols of the middle way. It can't easily just be reduced to idealizations of the goal. So that's why, well, I mean, obviously you can use enlightenment and the idea of enlightenment as a symbol of the middle way. There's nothing stopping you doing that, but you have to bear in mind that it's more than just the goal. And it's not just a description of the conditions either. So that's where, you know, if you only think in terms of scientific or psychological theory, that tends to stop just at a description of the conditions. It doesn't tell you what to do with them. It doesn't give you values or justification for those values beyond the ones that are required to understand and accept the theory. So this sort of recalling of this dynamic experience of the middle way needs to happen whenever we make a judgment, so that we make that judgment with sufficient awareness. So holding all these different things in tension, it's awareness of goals, the world around us, of ourselves, rather than focusing only on one of those things or the other, which is much easier and we're much more inclined to do. You know, so if we're going for a goal, we focus on that, got to reach that target. Or if we've got pain in our bodies, we focus on that, and so on. But the whole point of the middle way is to avoid absolutizing, and absolutizing is limiting your focus to just a certain area and assuming that's all there is and that's all that's important. So the middle way application to judgment could happen in any situation, and that's one of the things that really appeals to me about it. So it's not just about elite decision making, for example. It's not just about street entrance or some sort of high-ranked person, as it were. Even people who are in situations with very strong conditioning that makes them normally behave in particular ways that normally overpower them, perhaps could have a moment of awareness, which is a middle way awareness. So if you think of somebody like a drug addict, for example, who are normally have very restricted awareness, but yeah, just occasionally they might have a moment of realization, and that's the opportunity to change something, or the opportunity to start addressing all those conditions that are putting them in that dire situation as an addict. So even in the midst of highly addicted states, say, we could make a middle way judgment. It runs all the way, I think, from the lowest, as it were, to the highest point of awareness. So the middle way archetypal function, similarly, could operate at any point whenever we are reminded of the experience of finding the middle way, of balancing and moving forward by an associated symbol, whatever that symbol is. So let's get on then to the symbols and what the symbols might be. So as in all the archetypal symbols I've discussed in this series, you need to distinguish the symbol from the archetypes. The symbol could be anything in theory, because it's whatever you associate with the function. However, it's much more likely that humans will associate certain things with certain functions. But perhaps the recognition that it could potentially be anything applies even more to the middle way than to the other functions. But I will run through some of the most common sorts of symbols that perhaps most obviously or most helpfully could represent the middle way for us and provide that sort of inspirational reminder. So let's start with the concept. So I think I mentioned there's no reason why concepts can't be archetypal symbols. And so people are inspired by ideas like humanity, for example, you know, just thinking of that gets them going. So just the concept of the middle way itself could be your symbol. Obviously, the limitation of concepts is that they don't really get so much into your emotional experience a lot of the time anyway, depending on who you are and your temperament. So it may have limited associative power, and also there's an interpretation involved. There's a panning out, an application of the middle way. So it's not just the concept in the abstract. So in the society, we've obviously been looking for images of the middle way to use, and we tried to express this, and there's been quite a lot of debate about what the sorts of images we should use are, and some differences of opinion as well. This is a debate which is still going on at the moment. So what we tried to do, I think, in the images used by the society so far is to combine, I think, those elements. So the navigation or balance with forward movement in some way. So the symbol, an obvious symbol of the middle way, I think, needs to combine those two things in some way. So a person on a narrow bridge does that quite well. I think they're crossing the bridge. They're obviously balancing. They have to balance in order to not fall off the bridge. So that's quite a good one. Or a ship in a strait is one I've often used as well. So the ship has to navigate its way through the strait without hitting the rocks on either side. The rocks being the absolutizations. So a lot of I've often used the picture of the Peril Strait in Alaska to illustrate or represent the society. So a wide variety of symbols could be used though beyond that, and a wide variety of symbols, they usually involve perhaps some sort of balancing, some sort of ambiguity. Ambiguity can have some of the same functions, marginality, or process. So yeah, I'll mention a number of examples and show you some pictures of them as well, actually, which have some of those features. So first, symbols which involve spatial balancing between different elements. So in some ways, the Middle Way Society symbol does that. Another symbol that does that in a more sophisticated way is the mandala. So that's obviously a traditional symbol in Buddhism. It's also used extensively by Jung. So in Jung's Red Book, there are lots of mandalas, and Jung thought that the mandala was a universal pattern, so it could be found in other contexts as well. So if you look at rose windows in Christian cathedrals, sometimes those are a bit reminiscent of mandalas, for instance. Also there's a wonderful picture which we've got up at Tilden House, actually, which is the Mappa Mundi from Hereford Cathedral in England. It's this medieval map of the world, which is a circle divided into three parts, and it's got almost no resemblance to a modern map of the world, but it's a mythological map. Yeah? So it's in many ways it's a mandala. But what I'd see a mandala as how I'd see that as representing the middle way is that there's a spatial balancing between different elements which are integrated. I think the technical term for this is radial symmetry. Yeah, so there are different elements at different points in the circle, and those are symmetrical to each other, not necessarily along a single axis, but in multiple ways, possible ways. Let me share some pictures with you to discuss this a bit. So yeah, there are some wonderful mandalas in Jung's Red Book, and some of the earlier ones are vegetative ones, so they're based on drawings of seed casings and things like that. So this is an example of that, which is also in my book, Red Book, Middle Way. So yeah, obviously Jung was struck by the relationship or the similarities between a mandala form and a section of a seed case, or maybe a section of a plant stalk or something like that. But perhaps the more familiar kinds of mandalas are more obviously complex and more artificial patterns. This is another one from Jung's Red Book, where he incorporates archetypal figures in the pattern of the mandala. And as you can see, yes, it's not exactly symmetrical, and that's normally the case with most mandalas. That obviously the last one I think was completely symmetrical, but this one has asymmetries within the larger symmetry. Once you get into the detail of the patterns, which obviously shows some of the asymmetry of the things we have to integrate. You know, they may be having slightly different functions on different sides of us, as it were. So yeah, in this one, it's not quite the 4 archetypal functions. In this one, there's the wise old man at the top, which is like the go archetype. There's a anima on the right, I think, and then there were 2 shadow symbols. So there's no obvious hero. But anyway, that's, for some reason, that's what Jung wanted to depict at the time. But obviously, mandalas are probably more familiar from Buddhism. My favorite mandala from Buddhism is, sorry, I thought I was sharing it, but I wasn't then. Try again. Is this one. Yeah, so this is the 5 Buddha mandala. This is a Western representation of the 5 Buddha mandala by Arloka, Western Buddhist painter. And there you've got the 4 colored Buddhas represent 4 different types of quality, 4 different types of wisdom. And there's a lot of complex symbolism involved in this. So you'll have to look this up if you want more detail. But if you're interested in exploring the symbolism, it's a very rich thing to look at. But what I like about this is the way in which the different Buddhas and their qualities all obviously need to be integrated. They feed into the whole. Yeah. So the red and yellow Buddhas are more associated, for example, with compassionate approaches. The green Buddha with action, and the blue Buddha more with wisdom, with mirror-like wisdom. So you've got different complementary qualities involved here. Okay, so that's a little bit about mandalas, but that's just one possible symbol, obviously. Now another one which makes a great middle way symbol, I think, is the tree of life. So the tree of life is less a balancing symbol than a process symbol. So it's represents a process of growth from roots to the goal. Seen tree of life pictures, but so the tree of life, you know, it's used in Norse mythology, for example, but it's also used in different kinds of pagan approach. And the way it can symbolize the middle way is that it can link the roots to the crown, as it were. So it's used in that way, I think, in the Kabbalah particularly, as a symbol. the relationship between the roots and the crown, between the head and the feet, if you like. So the process of growth, starting in a particular point, just as the middle way has to do, and then branching out from it. And at each point, the tree ramifies, yes, so the tree branches out in different directions. So if we think in terms of the middle way, then we're following the path. Our past judgments are fixed as we follow the path, but we constantly encounter new growth points as we go on. So that's yeah, another kind of approach to middle way symbolism. Another one I've talked quite a lot about in various contexts is Christ. So Christ can be a symbol of the middle way through ambiguity, so not so much through balancing or through process. But the ambiguous thing about Christ as a symbol is that he's both wholly human and wholly divine. So the Nicene Creed, which is recited by Christians, makes a big point of this. I mean, it was a big point of controversy at the time. That, you know, Christianity is defined, or at least Orthodox Christianity is defined by that point, that Christ has to be both wholly human and wholly divine, even though in Aristotelian logical terms this is contradictory. You can't be both. So you can see this as a wonderful ambiguity, because humanity is our embodied starting point and divinity is kind of the elevated goal. And we can't just wholly have one or the other. We've got to constantly hold them in tension. And some of the representations of Christ make that point, that you know, he starts from a human standpoint, but he's also contains that divine element, if you like. So there's a picture I wanted to show you from Andrea del Sarto, but it's in my book, The Archetypes in Religion and Beyond, which shows Christ as an infant, as a little boy, as it were, standing on his mother's lap, holding the world. So the ones there at the same time, he's a little boy, he's a vulnerable child, but he's holding the world. So he's got this divine aspect to him. And they're both there together. And you can even see the crucifixion and the resurrection as a way of helping to develop this symbol, because conditions, those nasty human conditions, can continually frustrate all our goals. In fact, they can make things seem totally hopeless. They can seem like our hopes are dead. But then they can open quite unexpectedly, and the divine element, or the further goal, the unexpected potential, opens up in the form of the resurrection. Okay, so then the Buddha, of course, is very likely, many Buddhists particularly, to be an archetype for representing the middle way. And he can be, like any other symbol, but I think it does require the right focus to make him so. So the Buddha is usually seen as a symbol of enlightenment, and that could be interpreted with a rather one-sided focus on the goal rather than the process, and I think sometimes is. But if you focus on the Buddha's early life, for example, then that puts the middle way in a very embodied kind of context. So we've got the Buddha going forth from the palace, as the traditional story has it, because he saw beyond the assumptions made in the palace. He saw the limitations of that perspective. And then he went on into the forest, but then he met the teachers and the ascetics, and he realized the limitations of their view as well. So you've got them actually moving through the two extremes in the story and then finding the middle way. So it's a much more, you can use the Buddha, particularly perhaps if you think of the Buddha as going through that process and finding the middle way. So for me, certainly that engages with the middle way in practice much more than the later Buddhist philosophical formulations of the middle way do. You can also get middle way symbolism from the other main archetypal functions. So from the hero or the anima animus or the shadow, any of them can kind of turn into middle way symbols by becoming more integrated in one way or another. So if you think of a hero becoming more integrated, they do that. Perhaps they start off with a goal, which is the object of their quest, but they have to change that goal or modify their view of how they'll attain it. They have to become more provisional as they go, because they recognize the conditions. It's not just the goal, so they become less fixated on the goal and they gradually take in more and more of the rest of it. So a good example of that, or one of my favorites anyway, is Lord of the Rings. So Frodo sets off to cast the ring into Mount Doom, but by the time he gets there, he realizes he can't actually even do it himself. He actually relies on somebody else, someone who happens to have malicious intention to accidentally do it for him. He can't just cast the ring into the volcano. So things can happen in sort of unexpected ways, as that illustrates, perhaps. One can be heroic in unexpected ways. So the hero can morph into a middle way symbol. Like anima animus can also change in that way. So not just the attractive other, but as it becomes more integrated, it's also a reflection of oneself. So that's where we get into ambiguity, which might be represented by gender ambiguity. So Jung talks a lot about the hermaphrodite as a symbol of integration. And of course, today in the LGBTQ movement, there's talk about non-binary approaches, and which in some ways echoes that. And then there's the shadow figure. So again, even a shadow figure can, in some ways, become a middle way symbol by incorporating a wider recognition of the context of the threat. So the shadow becomes integrated with the non-shadow in some way. So a good example of that, again discussed by Jung, is Christ's descent into hell. So according to the medieval legend, this isn't in the Bible, but it was widely used in the Middle Ages. In the intervening day between Good Friday and Easter Sunday, Christ went down into hell to rescue the Old Testament prophets and other people who didn't fit into the scheme. So there's a theological justification for this, but symbolically, the idea is he goes into hell and he makes hell more complicated. So we begin to recognize actually all the people in hell aren't all sinners in the way we thought they were. So this new, slightly integrative recognition comes into things. And this person who we thought was completely separate from hell is in hell. So yeah, obviously that's an aspect of any kind of integrative symbology, that we can sort of combine the shadow with other things in one way or another. Okay, so that's a little bit about the symbols of the middle way. Now I should say something about the projection and integration of the middle way. So the projection of the middle way can happen whenever there's some kind of metaphysical interpretation of it, for example. So we can start off with what's genuinely a middle way understanding and middle way archetype representing it, symbol representing it. But when we start taking that to be the whole story and start neglecting the wider context or the process, then the middle way itself can just turn into a concept which becomes another whole story, another absolutization. So I think that's what happens when people turn the middle way into a metaphysical principle of some kind. And unfortunately, that's happened quite a lot when philosophers have discussed the middle way. So there's a book by Lou Marinoff called The Middle Way, which does exactly that. It's all about the middle way, but in a totally metaphysical sense, not one that seems to involve much practice or process. The Aristotelian golden mean can be a bit like that as well. So the idea that there's a sort of middle way built into the universe, you've just got to discover the truth of it, as it were. So that may be fairly harmless, but at worst, I think it sort of distracts us from the process that the middle way is about. And I think that also tends to happen with views of the Buddha, so where enlightenment substitutes for the middle way as a process. So the middle way itself gets forgotten. That seems to me to happen quite a lot when I talk to Buddhists about the middle way. So quite often I get some sort of response that they haven't thought about it really. Oh, well, that's interesting. What's the middle way about? Even though they use the middle way routinely as a synonym for Buddhism, and we'll talk about it as the middle way. But what does that actually mean? What does it imply? Often, it's not on Buddhist agendas. It's not discussed very much. Okay, so there are various traps. Can be projective traps. Can be involved with middle way archetypal symbols, just as they can with other archetypal symbols. But obviously, hopefully, if we're using it in a helpful way, then it will have an integrative effect. So it will prompt us to come back to middle way practice, and it will help us to overcome absolutization and thus overcome conflicts of all kinds, including conflict that's created by projection of any of the archetypes. I mean, it's probably worth just to bring out some of the integrative nature of the middle way archetype. To think about how it can resolve conflict, because perhaps conflict is the big way in which we become aware of the need for integration. So conflict can be created by focusing only on either side of the divide. So only on the ideal, only on the conditions. So if you only focus on the ideal, well, think about holy wars, for example, that are fought because people focus only on the symbols or the concepts that they think are holy, that are ultimately right, and they'll go to the extent of killing other people who think differently. But you could get the same thing in, say, a crash diet. So somebody has this rigid idea of an ideal figure they want to have, but they're just focusing on the ideal. They're not really focusing on the process, the complexity of how you get there and what's involved in the body's metabolism and so on. So whatever the over-focus on an ideal is, you can address it by bringing the surrounding conditions into awareness, being aware of more complexity. So maybe the middle way archetype, if it's working helpfully, can prompt you towards this. Yeah, so you can think, yes, not just that thing I want, or the ideal, or the goal, or whatever. So that's one side of the trap, if you like. But on the other, there's focusing only on the description of conditions. And often that happens if you focus only on a scientific description. It's not entirely value-free, even if some scientists would like it to be, but it probably takes limited values for granted. It doesn't allow us to examine and contextualize the values involved. So if you got, for example, a doctor without a bedside manner who kind of dehumanized the patient by talking about them in their presence as a set of parts, that will be very much, substituting the description for the whole view of the patient as a person, and assuming that was the whole story. Obviously, it's a useful tool, but it's not the whole story. Or you could take a determinist attitude to criminality. So you could go into a detailed description of exactly what the conditions were which led somebody to commit a crime. And that might look like a complete explanation of why they committed the crime, but there is also another side to that situation, which is the person's responsibility, their awareness of what they did, which obviously wasn't enough in this case, so they wouldn't have committed the crime, but it's part of the picture. So if you only focus on the determinist side and not the free will side, or vice versa, then you're limiting the understanding of the situation. So if you're focusing too much on the description of the situation, that can be addressed by bringing ideals and their implications into awareness, which basically means you need to have some confidence in some sort of interpretation of something being good or better than something else, so they have some values to apply, even if they're continually provisional, continually be examined once. Okay, so that's where I think the middle way archetype could be valuable. We could record it in all sorts of situations where it can help us to rebalance. In the end, of course, that brings us down to middle way practice, and that really is the subject of the next series. So the 5 principles is it's a way of summarizing in what's hopefully a helpful way the implications of the middle way as I've come to understand them over like 20 years of work or so. So I just thought I want to conclude this talk by just summarizing those 5 principles. So you've got a starting point there, which might bridge the divide. So between the idea of symbolizing the middle way as a source of inspiration and the middle way as a path. So we need some idea of what the middle way as a path is to link to the symbol. And obviously, if you've just got a set of ideas about the middle way, that's not going to be much good to you unless you have inspiration for following it. So you'll also need to link back to the middle way as a symbol. Anyway, so here's a quick preview of the 5 principles, which I think are an outline of what I think is involved in following the middle way. So the 5 principles, the first one is skepticism. So skepticism basically, as I'm using the term, is the recognition of uncertainty. But skeptical arguments can be helpful if we interpret them not as grounds for negative conclusions, but as grounds for recognizing uncertainty. So skepticism, in that sense, uncertainty is a basic motive for not thinking that we have the whole story, recognizing that we don't have the whole story. But obviously to do that, it needs to be applied even-handedly and consistently. So we're just as skeptical about negative claims as positive ones. Second principle is provisionality. So if we're making judgments that take into account uncertainty, then those judgments will need to be changed in the light of new information. So as we go on, we need to be able to adapt, to change our perspectives. And in order to do that in practice, we need to have access to alternative options. So we're not just locked into this absolute belief we have and the unthinkable alternative. So alternative options, or optionality, is a key feature of provisionality. So the middle way requires us to make constant adjustments for new information. And that's the act of embodied navigation, if you like. So the ship going down the strait has to constantly tack one way or the other. And of course, you even do that when you're crossing a room. So that's the second principle. Third principle, incrementality. So we can effectively avoid absolute judgments, thinking we have the whole story about something, by turning the things we're thinking about into increments. So we can make a practice of thinking in increments, thinking of things as matters of degree, rather than as whole stories, as whole qualities applied to things. It's just this or just that. So if we make a practice of that, it makes us think more empirically or experientially or practically. So that may include a scientific perspective, but it doesn't really stop there. Yeah, so it avoids these a lot of sweeping absolutist positions, metaphysical kind of positions, which are just not compatible with incrementality. So that's the third principle. Fourth principle is agnosticism. So agnosticism is the kind of defensive one. So it's alertness to the kind of tricks absolutism can involve, that keep drawing us to either side. All those currents and whirlpools that are about to bash our ship against the rocks on the right or on the left. So we need a certain wiseness or cleverness to be as tricksy as a serpent or whatever, to maintain our course in the middle. So we need to be able to reframe when there's a polarized debate going on, for example, between two absolutely opposed positions, to reframe it in different terms. So to recognize particularly that we don't know the answers to metaphysical questions. Even if there's huge social pressure to take sides, yes, we do know God doesn't exist, or we do know there is free will, or whatever it is. Well, actually, we don't, but we have experiential perspectives on these things. But that's quite different from knowing the answers to them in absolute terms. So agnosticism is the practice of doing that. And then finally, integration. So integration is dealing with the long-term conditions for balanced judgment. So obviously, if we're going to keep that ship sailing through the strait, or us walking across the room, or whatever it is, we need not only to be able to make balanced judgments at each point, but to have the conditions to do that in the longer term. So integrative practice can help us a lot with that. Integrative practice reduces conflict within us and beyond us. May do that by reducing stress in our bodies. That's one basic, perhaps temporary way of doing it. Meditation as an integrative practice. Or it may be at the other end of the spectrum, that we could be thinking critically in order to find beliefs that are more sustainable in the longer term. So that also reduces conflict. So there's a whole spectrum of practices that can be integrative, which I'll be talking about in much more detail in the next series at the end of it. So integration leads on to the threefold practice. Threefold practice is a way of describing the range of different practices that can be helpful for the middle way at both individual and social levels, and working out the levels of desire and meaning and belief. So different levels of practice. Okay, so I better stop there. So that was just a brief rundown, a sort of preview of the next series, a bridge to the next series, to get you thinking perhaps in the interval about the nature of middle way practice and how that can connect with symbols of the middle way. But I'm going to stop there for now and open up to questions.
When you were talking about the integration of balance and moving forward in the kind of dominant schemas that Lakoff and Johnson identified, I don't know why, but I was thinking about critical theory or critical thinking and appreciation, putting those together in a way that for me has something to do with how I symbolize the middle way. It's something, I find very inspiring and really positive about it. But the idea of critical thinking being integrated with appreciation.
Yeah. I mean, you could think of critical thinking as being part of the balancing bit, particularly because, well, particularly I mentioned skepticism and the need to be even-handed just now, and I think that very much involves critical thinking and applied in a particularly careful way, I'd add. Yeah, so it's not just a question of finding problems with a position, but also recognizing the limitations in your own position as you do so, for instance, so that you don't just react to the opposite position. But so that's where, yeah, critical thinking is so vital in the ways that it gives us that way of avoiding getting sucked into absolute assumptions, recognizing them before we're trapped in them. And obviously that's what enables us to move forward, but we wouldn't move forward if we didn't appreciate something that's valuable that we're moving forwards to, again, whether that's a goal or a relationship or potential or whatever it is. Okay, any other questions or comments?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I'm going to put this into words quite right, but is it the case that with that balancing and moving forward sort of framing of the middle way, that if I didn't move forward or balance, then I wouldn't have a need for the middle way? But in what sense would that look like a life that I wanted to live? Is that kind of part of it, that we kind of, it's not realistic to think about like stop the world, I want to get off, because that would sort of just put us in some kind of comatose or whatever. No, we wouldn't interact with anyone or have any hopes or goals or anything. That it's kind of a recognition of what seems like a fundamental part of what a good human life is one that is moving forward and paying attention to what's the conditions are around us, but wanting to go somewhere else and finding some way of negotiating the tension between those two things.
Yeah, you could see that very much as an aspect of the human embodied condition. Yeah, so there's nothing sort of a priori that means we have to be balancing and moving forward, but it's what we're like as in our embodied situation. Yeah, and we're going to have desires, so it's just part of being embodied and organic, but we're going to have desires, and that involves moving forward in some sense. So the balancing is what helps us to do that whilst addressing the conditions effectively.
And it's and any attempt to pretend that I don't have, or pretend to want to not have desires, or it is just going to be foiled by the fact that I'm embodied and I can't really, much as a lot of people do, try and dissociate themselves from that. It's going to be an aspect of that's going to play into the conditions of what's going to affect whatever my ambitions or goals are. I'm going to have to deal with things that I might wish weren't there, but are there.
Yeah, I mean that's the problem with asceticism as an impulse, that wishing you didn't have desires and having a desire to get rid of your desires, which is is very basically contradictory. Yeah, so that's where I think an integrative model is so much more helpful as a way of dealing with our desires and the conflicts that they create. Okay, any other questions or comments?
Well, just a comment about the symbols of the middle way. I found myself, when you were talking about the tree of life, thinking about forests, the new kind of studies that tell us how in the root systems of forests they communicate, the trees communicate and protect and help each other to live, share resources and so on. And it's just something that, as we studied the archetypes at the beginning, I want to learn more about that as a kind of symbol of the middle way. The forest as a symbol. Yeah.
Well, there's I mean, we resemble that in some ways. So we're not literally rooted, but we're rooted in the sense that we have all these interactions with basic conditions, and we have those interactions in the ways that we're rooted. So those mysterious communications between tree roots via fungal networks and so on, and they're there between people as well in a different sense. Yeah, probably one that's not so evident on Zoom, but anyway. Touch with it more than in face-to-face situations. Anyone else want to come in with any points?
Robert, I was wondering, I know part of your interest is in Ian McGilchrist's view on the split aspect to the brain, and how that conflict seems to be arising within different dynamics within the left hemisphere, from what I understand. I wonder if you could maybe just say a little bit about that, the habits or the processes that are going on between front portion of the brain and the emotional part on the back, and how they feed each other, and then how the middle way might work in relation to that?
Okay, yes. Well, I'd see the middle way is the alternative to absolutization. So in some ways, it's easiest to identify absolutization. First of all, and you can relate that to particularly as you just said, really to that neural loop. So between particularly the representations of the left prefrontal cortex, so the linguistic parts of the front of our brain, which it's where we create propositions. So it's not responsible for all the aspects of meaning, but it is responsible for the fact that we put words into sentences, propositions, and think that those represent reality in some way. Yeah, so that seems to be at the root of the kind of interpretation of meaning that you get in the left hemisphere, particularly when it thinks that's the whole story and gets stuck. Yeah, so it thinks that those propositions formed particularly by Broca's region in the left front brain are the whole story, but that's fueled obviously by a loop, which is often related to stress conditions from the so-called reptilian brain. So if you think about the role of anxiety or the role of craving, both of these are coming from much more deeply rooted points, which can feed into maintaining our rigid sense of that things are this way. So if you're driven by an addictive craving, for example, then you continue to think that the only valuable thing is finding this next fix. And that determines the whole way you see the world and the propositions you might describe it in. And of course, if you do get your next fix, then that maintains the craving and so on, back in the cycle. So that's a reinforcing feedback cycle, which seems to be associated particularly with the role of the left hemisphere in rigidifying propositions, representational propositions of the left hemisphere. But to be able to break that loop, we need some new information or acceptance of new information coming in from elsewhere, which can feed in to modify that loop. So that's where the right hemisphere comes in, because the right hemisphere is, in various different ways, helps us to become aware of new conditions, whether those are through our senses, things going on outside us, or emotional states, or new metaphorical possibilities even. All of those seem to be dealt with by the right hemisphere. So maintaining good enough links between the left and right hemispheres does seem to be nearly what's involved in the middle way. Yeah, so obviously there's a lot one could say about that and the interpretation of McGilchrist's work, but I'd certainly recommend The Master in His Hemisphere, and we have McGilchrist's earlier book. If you haven't engaged with that yet, as a way into the hemispheric way of understanding the middle way.
Thank you. Okay,
perhaps we better move on then before we run out of time. So I'll just say a little bit about the practice focus. So as usual, I'm just going to leave you with some questions really for practical reflection. So the practice focus theme is holding ideals in tension with the recognition of conditions. So that's obviously one of the things I've been talking about in the middle way, that we don't just get carried away with the ideals, we don't just get carried away with our description of the conditions. We hold them both together. So I've got 5 questions here, which I'm going to suggest you could reflect on. to help to think about how this applies to you in your own life. As usual, I will put this on, put my notes, including these questions, in the Slack area so people can refer to it. So the first question, what are the archetypal symbols you've connected to most strongly and durably during this series? So first of all, just reconnecting so far with, what is it that works for you? What are the archetypal symbols that inspire you? So once you're connected with that, obviously you've got some idea of what the ideals are, or what for you the ideals are, what will stand for an ideal or inspire you as an ideal. Second question, what practices do those symbols inspire you to engage in? So what's the relationship between what inspires you already and practice? Do they already inspire you to particular practices, like, for instance, meditation, or maybe philosophical reflection, or maybe art, or whatever it is? So that's the second question. Third question, what are the conditions that enable those practices to work? So now we're starting to shift the focus from not just recognizing what inspires you now and what sort of practices that helps you with now, but what are the conditions that depends on? So those kinds of conditions could be mental conditions, what are the states of mind you need in those practices? Maybe what states of mind you need to start them, not just the ones you want to cultivate in them. So it's one thing, for example, as I know one of my practices is playing the piano. It's one thing to, that has a really good effect on my mental state once I do it, but I also need to be in enough of a good mental state to start doing it to get back to my practice. So there's mental conditions, there's physiological conditions. So what about the states of your body? Obviously, if you're too tired or drunk or something, then you're not going to be, for example, you're not going to be able to practice very well. What the environmental conditions, enabling these practices to work? Do you have to get away from your noisy children, for example, or do you need to go and join your children and be stimulated by them? What about and social conditions? So are there people that can encourage or discourage you, for instance? So is there a social element? It could be a social practice, it could be involve interaction with other people. What are the economic conditions, maybe, that enable it to work? Sometimes it requires money, and even perhaps the political conditions. So certainly some practices may be discouraged by the authorities or enabled by them. So overall, that's the overall question. What are the conditions that enable those practices to work? Fourth question, how far do your inspirational symbols also operate to help you recollect and address those conditions? So you've got some symbols already, maybe, that inspire you to practice. Do those really help you to engage with the conditions that help you practice? So to say, well, going back to my example, it's great playing the piano. Do I also have the conditions that remind me to actually get up and go to the piano and play it, and do it at times when it would be helpful to me? So those are the total conditions in your life. So do the symbols that you have help you sufficiently with that? to address all the conditions involved. Okay, then final question. So are there explicitly middle way symbols that you could use to help you connect with balanced practice, with addressing all those conditions? Maybe there are, maybe there aren't. So think about whether there are particular symbols you could use to prompt you helpfully to engage with aspects of the conditions for your practice that maybe you weren't looking at so much before. That's assuming you're more of an ideal person rather than a conditions person, but you might just be a more scientifically minded person who focuses on describing the conditions and doesn't remember the ideals. So you might want to compensate in that direction instead. So basically, we've gone through a process there. I'll just run through the questions again. Yeah. So what are the archetypal symbols you've connected to most strongly and durably? What practices do those symbols inspire you to engage in? What are the conditions that enable those practices to work? How far do your inspirational symbols also operate to help you recollect and address those conditions to make that practice work fully for you? And are there explicitly middle way symbols you could use to help you connect with balanced practice? Okay. Any final questions about that or anything else? Okay, so we'll stop there then. This is the end of the series then, but I will continue as before, really. But starting on Tuesday, the 7th of February, same time, same Zoom link. So it may be very much the same format as I envisage it, although I will post more information on the specific. Well, I've already given titles for the specific sessions on the website, but I will post some more information about each one as we go on.
Robert, before we go, could I just tell you how much I appreciate you doing this for us? How important this has been for me. I mean, I just feel so enriched by it. And I want to thank Jim and Serena and George also for our meetings in between. Have just been great. Thank you all.
Great. Okay. Yep. So I hope, there'll presumably be another meeting in a couple of weeks, follow-up meeting. And we'll, again, presumably carry on doing that. With the Tuesday meetings at a time to be arranged. We can come back to that.
Okay.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Thank you. And thank you.
Yep, thanks. Thank you.
Yeah.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.